Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our very first lecture of a lecture series entitled Global Ruptures or New Beginnings, Southern Perspectives on World Politics. I've recently taken to turning off all news notifications on my phone because there's a sense of whiplash of not knowing where to turn to, what to hear about, and how to understand it. Yet, as we wrote in the description of this lecture series, the world as we know it is rapidly changing. And ignoring this is also not a solution, or a very smart thing to do if you're a political scientist by profession, like myself. Wars, environmental destruction, the rise of right-wing populism, and increasingly polarized international relations. Is this a time of rupture, where the world as we understand it will change forever? Or not also a moment for new beginnings? What do we know about this new world? How can we better understand it and find ways forward? In contrast to the backlash against key and post-colonial scholarship, we propose that it is actually high time to hear from and show the importance of understanding the world from the lens of the majority world, where most people in the world live. Governments, organizations, and people in the global south have long been pushed to the peripheries of world affairs and knowledge production. In this lecture series, we aim to showcase the importance of understanding the world from Southern perspectives. And I, for sure, look forward to learning from our speakers throughout the summer semester. The ALMA lecture series, ALMA stands for Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Asia, is an occasional series organized by the Arnold-Bergstraesser-Institut at the University of Freiburg in cooperation with Colloquium Politicum. This year's lecture series is also co-organized with the Decoloniality Now Center of the University of Freiburg. This multidisciplinary initiative seeks to understand the impact of coloniality on today's world and the ways in which people and institutions in all regions of the world, including our own, remember, perpetuate, and contest the legacy of colonialism with a focus on the present day of now. I now pass the floor to Dr. Eike Jens, the cluster head of the research on contested governments at the ABI, to introduce the speaker of tonight and to lead us through the evening. Thank you, Eike.
Thank you so much, Franziska. No better way to introduce the evening, I think. I'm so excited for tonight. I'm very, very glad to welcome María. Dr. María Cárdenas Alfonso is a postdoc researcher in the area culture and migration at the Institute of Sociology at Goethe University of Frankfurt. She's also an associate member at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. She wrote her doctoral thesis in sociology on ethnicized activism and its decolonizing potential to build pluriversal peace in Colombia. And she received an excellent summa cum laude for it. Congratulations again. And an honorable mention from the Gerd Sanger Award for Peace Psychology. But Maria really has long worked on anti-decolonial and pluriversal perspectives, especially on peace and state building and international cooperation. She's now going more into the direction of international relations, which is great for us for this lecture series. At the moment, she's leading a network together with Professor Dr. Encarnacion Gutierrez in Frankfurt, where you, if I understand correctly, you analyze the tensions in societies with far-reaching transcultural social movements on the one hand and authoritarian tendencies on the other. So that's also very interesting and feeds into what we are expecting for the lecture series. Among her many achievements, she also forms part of the executive board of the German Association for Peace and Conflict Research. And she's published in several well-known journals. For example, a recent article on pluriversality and governance, Lessons from Colombia, in International Affairs. She's also published in Peace Building, in our area. These are really well-known names. And your book, Building Peace for the Pluriverse, Decolonizing Peace Activism and Ancestral Epistemologies in Colombia, is set to come out soon with Bristol University Press. So congrats again. And there's a lot that you can also already show off. Your talk is entitled, Is This New? I think it's a very good question. For whom are things new? This idea of rupture that we are perceiving. And you're aiming at unmasking uncertainty and rising fascism through knowledge and wordings from the Americas. I'm particularly glad that you accepted our invitation. We've known each other for quite a few years, and we share some research interests, but particularly because of what you are proposing for tonight. That is to overcome, to some extent, the pessimist and even fatalist panorama of debates here in the global north, based on growing uncertainties for populations that used to be pretty privileged. And you want to do that by telling us more about the collective life-making practices and discussions by Indigenous and Afrolatinx movements in the Americas. There are discussions of persistence, of remaining, pervivencia in Spanish, of resistance to actually life-threatening politics. So that's what we are looking forward to. About the logistics, Maria will talk about 40 minutes. I'll give you a warning at about 30, and then we will turn to questions and comments, and really everyone feel invited to ask. And this is really supposed to be a fruitful exchange. And yeah, whatever you want to know and put into the discussion, you're welcome to do so. Welcome, and over to you, Maria.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you very much for everyone for being here. Very cool to see so many faces, and I'm very much looking forward to discuss with you, to talk with you. Yeah, so first of all, thank you to the organizers, to the RBI, the Colloquium Politicum, to the Decoloniality Now initiative, for opening this lecture series, and for opening the space to think about these, about what perspectives from the global south can contribute to understanding and dealing with our present, and also from this place where we are in Germany, in Europe. So I'm not sure if I will disappoint you. I really warned you about that. Yeah, well, definitely wars, environmental destruction, the rise of right-wing populism, and the polarized international relations are definitely worth taking some time to think about. To me, this present seems not so much as neither global rupture nor new beginning, but rather traveling and spiral escalation of the old. That it is perceived as a rupture or as new, and hence provokes feelings of uncertainty, rather underlines the argument that I want to make, that our hegemonic ontology, our ways of seeing and engaging with the world, are incapable of understanding and therefore addressing the multiple interlocked crises that we face. So what I want to suggest is to think about the rise in fascism in our societies and the normalization of violence for political and economic profit in two ways. First, not as ruptures, but as the spatially expanding negative effects of how what others have called coloniality has materialized in the global south and travels. And second, as a last resort for maintaining a system that on the one hand is increasingly revealing itself as self-destructive, and on the other is challenged by existing social and political practices in Latin America and elsewhere, and which are gaining strength and legitimacy for their feasibility. To make my argument, I begin with MSSR's assessment. Oops, sorry, this shows too. I begin with MSSR's assessment of fascism in its commonalities to coloniality. I then introduce the concept of coloniality and draw on the ontological turn to demonstrate the untenability of the prevailing logics and paradigms of our contemporary world. I will then turn towards some examples from my research in Colombia to discuss how we could exit this current downward spiral and what that could mean. To do so, I draw on almost a decade, as you said, of engaging with and learning from ancestral intellectuals in what today is Colombia, and decolonial, ancestral, and Black theorizing from the Americas and the Caribbean. The talk is mostly a mix-up of previously published articles, and includes some material from my forthcoming book, which you already talked about. And finally, I want to say that I speak and think here from my German Colombian positionality, and thus from the border, as the Chicanas call the Gloria and Saldua would say. Well, to start, the idea that fascism in Europe or the global north is a boomerang effect of the colonialism in the global south is not my idea. Authors have argued this a long time ago. Aimé Césaire from Martinique, who had lived, worked, and studied in France in the 1930s, until returning to Martinique in 1939, had already argued in the 1950s that fascism, the way it materialized in the 20th century in Europe, particularly in its occupation, well, German occupation of other European countries, was in fact a choc en retour, a boomerang effect of colonialism. Let us read what Aimé Césaire wrote at the time. You can read that, yes. And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, how strange. But never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but before that, before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. So what Aimé Césaire argued was, on the one hand, that the practices of colonization, such as the violence against other peoples, the imprisonment, torture, and assassination, the genocidal violence as well, and the surveillance techniques that allowed to do so were brought back to Europe under the Nazis. So the technologies of fascism had been already technologies of colonialism before. But another aspect is crucial and interesting for me here. Césaire criticizes white European society's reluctance in acknowledging their own involvement and complicity in developing these forms of violence against non-Europeans and against racialized peoples. The idea of an imperial boomerang has been taken up again recently. For instance, authors and journalists have made reference to it with regards to the current US administration and the ICE raids, such as the sociologist Julian Goethe in an interview to the Huffington Post in February this year, who argued how tools and tactics developed and military stuff deployed from foreign territories is now being used on protesters in the US. So not only the tactics, but also the personnel itself has been recycled to be used against protesters in the US. But we also see another comeback from fascism, which Theodore W. Adorno, and his colleagues had shown in their studies on authoritarianism. Hostility towards one group increases the likelihood of hostility towards other groups. Hostility against racialized groups and migrantized groups, such as in the US, is not the end, as we also currently see there in the discussions about women's suffrage or the family vote in the United States. And we can also see signs of a choc en retour, a boomerang effect in Europe, can't we? We see the creation of internal enemies through empty signifiers, such as through the criminal migrant or those who defraud the welfare state. We see how these are used to criminalize protest and to debate the withdrawal of hard-won rights, such as Social Security, paid sick days, or, of course, the rights of refugees to be granted asylum. These debates not only foster intergroup competition, an important element for fascism, but they also legitimize the increase of other authoritarian practices, such as militarization, surveillance, and control. All the while the mass media reproduces and fosters these narratives as well because of the clickbait. So we know from history how fascism works, how it expands in and across societies, oppressing one group or nation after another. Why is it that we are again surprised, indignant, to use Césaire's words, after all these years? How is it that we are still uncertain about how to deal with the crisis that we provoked? How can Latin American perspectives help us with that? And this brings me to coloniality. So when we talk about coloniality, we often refer to the coloniality of power, a theoretical framework that emerged in the 1990s, put forth by influential thinkers from Latin America and the Caribbean, such as Enrique Dussel. So first of all, Aníbal Quijano, of course, but also in dialogue with Enrique Dussel, Santiago Castro Gomez, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and further developed through the coloniality of gender by María Lugones. However, it's important to say that other anti-decolonial theoretical frameworks from Latin America had paved its way, such as the liberation framework in the 70s, also advanced by Enrique Dussel, such as the liberation philosophy, from Paulo Freire, Pals Borda, Ignacio Martín Baró, and others, and the concept of internal colonialism in the 50s, advanced by the Mexicans Pablo Gonzalo Casanova and Rodolfo Steivenhagen, who actually migrated or sought asylum in Mexico from Frankfurt, which is further developed until today by influential scholars such as Silvia Rivera Cosicanqui and Veronica Gara. Both of these concepts or strands have their validity, and the concept of internal colonialism more explains the process through which coloniality is produced daily on the national level, on the social, structural, and more in its dynamics with each other, and the coloniality of power refers a little bit more to the international, to the global framework, right? A new matrix of power in the modern world, as Maldonado Torres would say. Building on these theoretical frameworks, coloniality can be understood as a system that initiates with colonialism and reinforces hierarchical and exploitative relations in favor of capitalism. However, it is a bit more complicated. These categories that are established, such as race or racialization, gender, class, do not merely exist and are used to perpetuate it, and are used to perpetuate colonialism through the use of force. Rather, the use of force becomes just one out of several interdependent and interlinked mechanisms that together uphold the coloniality. And so that's why then the several authors developed the coloniality of knowledge, for instance, such as the categorization, institutionalization, and de-authorization of knowledge, along with the destruction and erasure of other knowledges, also called epistemicides, the coloniality of being, such as the differentiation and hierarchization of people along racialization, gender, disability, and geopolitical location, the coloniality of gender itself, the creation of a binary system of gender, but also the imposition of the sex-gender binary and patriarchy onto other peoples as a means of colonization and to destroy, for instance, matriarchal communities to better be able to control these communities and their bodies. And then the coloniality of nature, which not only includes the colonialism of nature in its literal sense, but the establishment of nature through the human-nature divide, which is linked to the idea of subjectivity as limited to humanity, to some humans really, and with this, the right to exploit nature. So a complex system develops wherein coloniality becomes a particular way of understanding, defining, seeing, and recreating the world. Inspired by the multiple ways of seeing and engaging with the world in the Amazon and the Andes, over the last 20 years or so, the ontological turn has been put forth, emerging from anthropology. This led to a questioning of the universality of the Western ontology and motivated authors such as the Argentinian Mario Blazer and the Peruvian Marisol de la Cadena to argue that first, there are a plurality of worlds, and B, ontologies, building practices that are based on principles that are politically relevant and have political implications. So they are always political. As the Colombian scholar Amaya Querejasu argues, the study of what is depends on our cosmology, on how we see the world, which can be atomistic or relational. She explains, and I quote, drawn from Newtonian cosmology that conceives of reality as primarily constituted by atoms, units, atomistic ontologies refer to a type of rationality founded on the premise that entities are singular essences that exist on their own as separate, present, and definable. An ontology that, as she says, has become dominant and universalized, effacing other realities of world. So the important thing to understand about coloniality is, from my perspective, or from the perspective of the ontological term, that with colonialism, an atomistic ontology has been put forth that has erased others and other ways of seeing and universalizes a way of understanding the world based on a thinking in entities that are separate, independent, identifiable, and static. A binary subject-object logic, for instance, human and nature, and a linear time. So it produces a specific worlding, as Arnold-Bergstraesser and María call it, that defines, separates, and hierarchizes. So the coloniality of knowledge shapes what we know and on which premises we develop our thinking. So this is intertwined. And coming back to the question of why, as Europeans, we cannot grasp and confront rising fascism, an answer might lie in that we have internalized these underlying fundaments or ingredients that give rise to authoritarianism, fascism, and the normalization of war. So if coloniality can be thought of as a universalizing system that objectifies people and land and destroys other worldings, this means that there are also other worlding practices, right? Only on the territory of what today is called Colombia, there are still 115 indigenous nations, plus 18 avoiding contact, and there are a variety of African descendant communities that have recreated their life, their worlds after the transatlantic slave trade through what the Colombian Adolfo Albana-Chinte has described as re-existence. They give testimony of that we live, in fact, not in a universe, but in a world of many words, a pluriverse. In line with this existing reality, Latin American scholars such as Marisol de la Cadena, Cristina Rojas, and Arturo Escobar have also put forth in dialogue with these communities in the Americas a theoretical debate about the pluriverse and what that means with regards to, for instance, concepts or phenomena such as violence, peace, security, or justice. For instance, the Colombian scholar Daniel Ruiz Serna has argued in dialogue with Afro-Colombian communities that war in Colombia extends beyond the human and affects many other beings with whom people share the forests and rivers in the Pacific, one of the most biodiverse places in the world. He argues that if we were to look for a more inclusive, transitional, and restorative justice, this would mean to expand reconciliation to the lively relationalities of the people and to their natural worlds, taking into account the agency and personhood of beings such as animals, rivers, forests, mountains, or spirits. So how would other ways of engaging with the multiple current interlocked crisis look like? How could we, in fact, imagine new beginnings? Or what would this mean? And to break out of this downward spiral. Let us consider a quote from a rival activist from the island of San Andres, which is in the Caribbean, with whom I've worked and to which I also refer my book. So she says, "We aren't hoarders. At my house, my husband picks guavas and leaves some behind. I tell him, honey, look, there are some more guavas on the tree over there. And he says, no, leave those for the birds. That's for the animals. We aren't hoarders, scavengers, who have to take everything and rip it out just because it's there and sell it and turn it into a product. We aren't like that. We just want to live in peace with our surroundings, with our brothers, and with ourselves." So as we learn from this activist, an extractivist ontology is not guided necessarily by an evil behavior. It's not about that. It represents a worldview that shapes our most basic interactions. many of us might think, and that was my first reaction, it is most efficient to take all the fruit from the tree to make marmalade, juice, etc., so we don't waste anything. We would not call it hoarding because it has a good intention, but it comes from a perception of efficiency that is ego-anthropocentric and short-sighted, and capable of grasping the relationality between beings and across time, and the balance needed between different species for all to survive. So the idea of rationality put forth through atomistic ontology, as Amaya Kerehasu calls it, is irrational in the long run. This is interesting because it breaks with an idea that coloniality has put forth, that rationality is a particular quality of the colonizer, of the white and educated man. It is an idea that has historically been, and is still, used to deny the right to vote to women, to people who don't adhere to or fit into society's norms and rules, and to racialize people, of course. The quote illustrates the short-sightedness of a linear concept of time and how a cyclical view teaches us that for cycles to repeat, certain conditions must too. Understanding that we depend on these birds' survival to maintain our tree full of fruits and our belly full in the future makes leaving fruit on the tree more efficient and logical, hence rational. From a relational perspective, then, other approaches come to the fore that build peace and security or protection, seeking harmony and balance with the other and the more than human world, based on an understanding that the I can only remain in relation with the other. This is based on the unconditional acceptance of the autonomy of the other and our indissoluble articulation through relationality. In some Colombian regions that are particularly affected by armed violence, Indigenous Afro-Colombian and small peasant communities have therefore engaged in ways of unarmed collective protection mechanisms, for instance called guardias, that understand security as something that can only exist in relation with the other human and the more than human, human. It is through the renouncing of weaponry that mechanisms such as these have been able to prevent their communities from being absorbed by violence, and to protect their communities and territories against armed actors, despite significant losses. Rethinking peace and security integrally, as in protecting and securing nature, as well as finding protection and security in nature, allows us to ask, how can security really be achieved? How could it be maintained in the long run? This includes rethinking what measures security entails and how it cannot be achieved and who or what creates insecurity in this world. Interestingly, Latin America becomes visible then not only as the place from where Europe defined itself as the one who walks ahead, but also as a place from where Europe can learn how to walk with, gaining understandings towards relational solutions to the contemporary crisis that may scratch at or even exit coloniality. Over the last years, several dynamics have developed in Colombia that offer, I believe, food for thought on how we could transform coloniality and overcome the ignorance towards fascism which it entails. I will limit myself here to two examples that are interlinked. One is the national strike, and the other are transitional justice rulings over the last years. Both emerged from a changing landscape. In 2016, a peace agreement was signed in Colombia between the state and the oldest guerrilla of the continent. It was hoped to bring an end to violence after decades of war. It defined the possibility of peace as also dependent on the transformation of other forms of violence, such as exclusion and inequality. Therefore, not only women and LGBTIQ rights were included, but also rights to protect and strengthen political discourse, and an ethnic chapter, which was the result of a joint struggle of Indigenous and Afro-Colombian activists, whom you see here, which should guarantee that peace building would respect their rights to participation and to difference. This motivated a lot of people to have hope and to demand that violence, injustice, and inequality be overcome. When years later, not only peace building had been blocked by the right-wing government, the assassination of social activists skyrocketed, and reforms should further marginalize the popular classes, while corruption and police brutality continued. National protests emerged between 2019 and 2021 all over the country and in the diaspora too. In the cities, communal practices emerged to keep the protests alive, countering individualism and isolation, which had been advanced by the pandemic. As my colleague Viviana Garcia Pinzon, who's today here with us, argued, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about this in the discussion, communal cooking became one of the cornerstones of the reproduction of life amid the politics of death deployed by the police forces. Moreover, cross-sectorial solidarity developed, where Indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and small peasant guardias, which I mentioned before, supported the protesters and helped protect them. This social dynamic was also mirrored in a sense by the work of the transitional justice mechanisms, which recognized, building on the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement, that for one, racism is a structure that has shaped all armed actors' actions in the conflict, and so that the disproportionate suffering of ethnicized populations was not at all collateral, but intentional. And as a result, ancestral peoples, but also ecosystems in Colombia, are entitled to reparations and non-repetition, and the non-repetition includes restoring justice to relational worldings, such as here you can see that how the special peace jurisdiction recognized the River Cauca as a victim of the armed conflict in July 2023. This interpretation of the right to non-repetition also advances national and global trends, because the recognition of ecosystems as victims could strengthen community scope of action in the future. We need to wait and see how the material effect, that these social, political, and legal developments entail, but they have denormalized the ontological violence that coloniality has imposed onto other worldings in Colombia. I would argue that these events have had an impact on many Colombian self-understanding too, countering the ignorance that had prevailed towards historical and present injustices and forms of violence brought about by coloniality. And an example of this is, for instance, that when, as you can see here on the left, one of the indigenous nations, the Misak people, turned down one of the colonial statues. There was a huge debate in Colombia about the legitimacy of this action, and in fact, many population groups were in favor of that. It was finally time to revise the honoring of genocide defenders and enactors such as Belalcázar, which was the statue that had been thrown down. Since Afro-Colombian and Indigenous have taken also on key roles in ministries, and collective land titles have been increased and natural reserves have been expanded. All of this is, of course, a problem for extractivist racial capitalism, because capitalism needs the coloniality of nature and the coloniality of being in order to be maintained. I have started this talk arguing that the rising fascism, the authoritarianism, and the normalization of war are continuities and accelerations of coloniality, not ruptures. But they are not only a shock of the tool, a boomerang effect, as Aimé Césaire has called it. They are also attempts at stabilizing coloniality as a self-destructive system in a moment where its destruction comes closer to those who previously benefited from it. And when it has been demystified and dethroned in many places of the world, such as in the Americas, where social and political struggles have put forth ways of maintaining life in relation and in difference, and have gained traction. Cross-sectorial solidarity has grown, and coloniality has been destabilized in places such as in Colombia. Scholars often working with these struggles have thus put forth debates within academia about the pluriverse as an existing reality. In offering alternatives to the one world world, as John Law has called it, these developments threaten coloniality as the sine qua non, and with it, its extractivist racial capitalism. Adorno argued more than 70 years ago that capitalism, with its standardization of the world and the conformism it requires, alienates the individuals from real-life experiences, making them available for authoritarian ideologies and politics of hate. Today's standardization has not only achieved unprecedented levels in our lives, amongst other things through algorithmically mediated minds, but we have also become more individualized and isolated, not least through the pandemic and digital technologies. In this context, techno-fascism can find a fruitful ground to fertilize coloniality against all odds. In order to counter contemporary politics of hate, violence, and death, we should put the protection of the pluriverse front and center. It's not only the best way for this planet to remain, but should be in almost everybody's interest as the noose tightens around our necks. One way of protecting the pluriverse is understanding how ontological violence works, through erasure, invisibilization, and silence. Aimé Césaire and other scholars have made it very clear that we all participate in one way or another in coloniality and in fascism. We are complicit. Over the last years, I have remembered a piece I read during my bachelor's, The Spiral of Silence, by the German communication scientist Elisabeth Nölle-Neumann. Her work explained how people tend to remain silent if they think they have a minority of opinion, independently of whether this is the case or not, in order to not be isolated. This happens. So in remaining silent, people reinforce the impression that their view is in the minority, and in this way unwittingly contribute to strengthen the opinion, which first might have not been the strongest, but the loudest only, and second, which they themselves do not share. So in order to reverse this effect, and building on the lessons from the Americas, I think we need to reconnect meaningfully with each other across difference and indifference, and make this visible to break the spiral of silence. This reassures us of the multiple perspectives that exist, and of the perspectives of each of us can have a place from where we can cherish and visibilize diversity and difference, relationality, and ask others to do the same. Articulación, as one of the intellectuals I worked with argued, is not about becoming one or even agreeing, but about remaining in difference while engaging in dialogue. Let me end with the following quote from the Peruvian scholar Marisol de la Cadena and the Argentinian Mario Glaser. The moment of the realization of the destruction of the earth, the current historical moment, can be one when people reconsider the requirement that worlds be destroyed. It can also be one when the conditions of dialogues towards the reconstruction of worlds can be formulated.